Good morning, good afternoon. The session for this afternoon is titled Education for Citizenship in a Digital World. Just going to give you a couple of sentences as to why this came about. Ed Twaniak are co-conspirators in a lot of things, and so we spent some time in the fall commiserating over what seemed to be a lot of oddities going on in the public press. And so I sent him a proposal on the following basis. The recent presidential campaign raised the issue of, quote, false news, unquote, that was spread primarily by social media having negative consequences for voter decision-making. The Compendium of Social Doctrine of the Church devotes chapters 8 to 10 on the political community, paragraphs 114, 116, on the topics of information and democracy in a theological perspective, to organize a conversation about the role of education to prepare people for their responsibilities to be informed voters in a democratic society. Younger citizens are increasingly focused on social media sites for gathering news and information for decision-making. Does this behavior change, and how critical thinking skills and communication skills are developed in their form of education? So with that, the people who've been brought here are people we think have some perspective that will add to the conversation. I don't think we're going to come up with any real answers to it, but I think we need to talk about the notion of the role of education in what we're going to be doing going forward. So our first presentation is from Tom Cohen. Tom is Associate Editor at the Berrugian Institution, an organization that funds the research of contemporary philosophers. Fortunately, it's not as narrow as, say, media ecology-related philosophers, but contemporary philosophers and social scientists, as well as connecting thinkers that are dealing with policymakers around the world. He works primarily on the Institute's online magazine, Insights, which solicits essays from experts to answer questions about important challenges we face today. Tom is a graduate of St. Mary's College in our Integral program, our Great Books program. He has a master's in humanities from Dominican University, and I had the pleasure of having Tom as a student. So in some ways, Tom knows that he's not going to be graded for what he does this afternoon.
Thank you, Ted. As part of my work at the Concurrent Institute, I've had the pleasure of doing a number of interviews, and one of them is with Thomas Ilves, who is the former president of Estonia. The interview focused on Estonia's emergence as a democratic state in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Though Estonia is a very small country, under the guidance of President Ilves and others, it sought to position itself as a strong, independent state. And in order to do so, Estonia embraced new and innovative technologies in order to position itself as a kind of prototype for states in the digital age. These innovations included electronic citizenship, electronic voting, and other applications that helped to form Estonia as a proverbial Estonia. In addition to this work in technological implementation, President Ilves is a noted proponent of cultural education. It seems, therefore, that a pragmatist may also dream. In our interview, he made reference to C.P. Snow, who was one of the first to call for integration and dialogue in academia rather than specialized silos. Speaking of this, Ilves said to us, quote, "Lawmakers and policymakers rarely understand technology and often treat it as some kind of magic, either all-powerful or darkly evil. Those in technology, in my experience, rarely have a firm grasp of the underpinnings of ethics or democratic principles deriving from the same enlightenment that spurred science in the subsequent centuries to develop with such leaps and bounds," end quote. This is accurate but needs an addendum. The lack of communication between academic departments and in the specialized majors that are produced therein does nothing to mitigate the increasingly fractured political discourse of our nation and world. It is not merely the fault of digital discourse that we are a fractured nation. We are fractured because the information and content we provide to students is fractured and incomplete. This is not to say that technology does not exacerbate the problem, but that what we need, more than newer technologies or hyper-specialized majors, is the reintegration of holistic, complete education in all disciplines for all students in order to improve the quality of the conversation. The liberal arts, in their original sense, are this complete educational package. The original liberal education included all of the arts and sciences, whereas the contemporary usage of the term is much more limited. The question remains of how to integrate technology into something like the liberal arts. The solution, I think, is the same that President Ill suggests, which is to say a holistic education that teaches everything. The difficulty in that, however, is that technology is often, wrongly, treated as its own end rather than as a means to an end, such as knowledge. This is to say that the liberal arts can be disseminated through digital media, but certain sacrifices and concessions will be made. If students who are or soon will be citizens are dependent on or inextricable from digital sources of information, then we must raise the tenor and quality of those media. It is necessary to improve all discourse through holistic and complete educational programs and sources of knowledge rather than the fractional or specialized programs that exist today. This would, in no small part, impact the mutually understood and shared ground of discourse itself. Therefore, the solution I'm offering is twofold. We must reintegrate knowledge in the colleges while simultaneously promoting healthy uses of technology as a medium for transmitting this complete knowledge. Of course, since this is a media ecology conference, it would be remiss of me to not put this into the appropriate vocabulary. Technology, including the recent digital revolution, is an environment where we can create and share information or, hopefully, knowledge. Like in nature itself, only certain seeds can grow in any particular environment. You wouldn't plant evergreens in Hawaii, for instance. It is simply not appropriate. However, despite the state of our environment, we have the capacity to adapt. We can create biomes, albeit curated, where we control the climate and soil. To leave that thinly stretched metaphor, we can create communities online where complete sources of knowledge are promulgated. We can create schools that use digital technology without discarding complete knowledge. We must strive to control our environment so that the seeds planted and disseminated are whole and true, and we must curate our communities so that our greater democracy is not left hollow without dialogue or critical thought. In Plato's Republic, the first line of the section known as the Allegory of the Cave runs as such. Quote, "Next, said I, compare our nature in respect of education and its lack to such an experience as this. Picture men dwelling in a sort of subterranean cavern with a long entrance open to the light on its entire width. Conceive them as having their legs and necks fettered from childhood so that they remain in the same spot, able to look forward only and prevented by the fetters from turning their heads. The educational paradigm as it currently exists serves to fractionalize discourse by disallowing knowledge that overlaps with the understanding of others. Specialization, as an approach to understanding, predictably mirrors our greater national discourse, which appears to lack any coherent narrative or common ground. Completeness, regardless of the medium used to convey that completeness, is imperative. One of the interpretations of the Allegory of the Cave, especially based on that first sentence, is that education is extremely formative, and that the way we teach students dictates the way they live and participate in their communities. The negative impact of technology on the consistency of thought is undeniable. However, what I'm suggesting is that we have allowed digital media to further exacerbate an already fractionalized state of knowledge. The solution, and one which will translate into improved discourse online, is to create shared educational programs instead of fractionalized ones. So that's my spiel. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. I think the setup we have will work this afternoon. Our next presentation, before we get into the general discussion, is from Matt Peterson. He's professor of media, politics, and culture at John Paul University in Southern California, and is creating a fledgling think and do tank dedicated to the exploring and theory and practice of modern media and rhetoric in the light of Catholic intellectual tradition. Matt is a graduate of Thomas Aquinas College in Southern California. Just the historical footnote, that's the successor college to the old St. Mary's College, since the founders of Thomas Aquinas were all from St. Mary's, and some of my former teachers that I remember fondly. He went on to Claremont Graduate University, where he completed his education in political philosophy and American government. Matt has taught at Claremont McKenna, Loyola Marymount, and at Pepperdine University. His dissertation is currently in preparation for publication, The Meaning of Public Good and the Rhetoric of Ratification. He has served on the staff at the Claremont Institute, the Rose Institute as a state and local government at Claremont McKenna. He's worked as a political consultant and as a vice president of a production company, so he's got direct hands-on media experience. And he's served as a vice president for 3 years of an evaluation firm evaluating the effectiveness of federal education grants in American history and civics nationally. So let's go on to that.
Great. So, political science degree, we have to go to the cynical side right away. And how I wanted to start this is to mention a very interesting survey, a national survey that's been conducted the last 2 years, I think, by some folks at Chapman University. And the survey looks nationally at fears, Americans' fears. What are they afraid of? And I would wonder, can you guess what the greatest fear? Right? It's not a matter of depth, right? But what do most people all agree on that they're afraid of? By a long shot, I think it's by 15%, roughly, in both years they've conducted this survey.
Public speaking.
Yes, that's always a good one.
Death.
Death and taxes, right? I mean, death is, certainly terrorism is up there.
Financial rules.
That's up there too.
Embarrassment.
That's up there.
Sickness.
The Russians. Government corruption. Corruption.
Corruption.
I find that statistic, I find it very interesting, and I'd like to see that replicated, obviously, in other surveys. But this is even before the election, right? So there's this fear in the populace at large, a shared fear. I'm not sure how deep it is, right? But there's a fear that's shared that corruption is a problem in our society. Now, if we think about, we're going to talk about civic education and fake news and all this other stuff in light of the election. But think about the disconnect between the fear of corruption and news programming in, say, the last 20 years or so. I mean, do you see that replicated in news programming? There's all kinds of reasons for this, right? Journalism has suffered terribly for economic and other reasons in the last 20 or so years. But if you take, say, small town life, which I'm very familiar with, I would get paid to go in and describe how a city ticks, a small city ticks, what makes it go round, who are the major players. And I would be paid to do that by private interests. This is information that you should know because you live there. And why was that necessary? That was necessary because there was no longer a free press in that region covering that city. There were no longer 3 newspapers, right, that people subscribed to. And because of this, no one's watching, right? No one's watching what's going on. So I think that disconnect between an actual fear of corruption and then what you see in news programming is a great intro into what the problem is that we face right now. Now, if you think about this culturally, you see all kinds of signs that we know that corruption is a problem in our democracy, right? I mean, think of the success of The Wire, which is probably one of the first successful golden age of TV shows, which is very much about a real-world experience, right, on the part of David Simon, fantastic writer who was a journalist, about the city of Baltimore. You see corruption all throughout The Wire. And of course, one of the most popular shows on right now is House of Cards. Right, so you see this in our fiction increasingly. You see this in our fiction, but that's still fiction, right? That's still fiction. And so part of this is just the demise of economic problems with journalism, right? I mean, it hasn't been able to, it takes a lot of resources to actually investigate corruption. But why is it the case that there's a disconnect between this fear in the populace and between what you see and what we would call non-fake news, right? What we would regard normally as the news, all the news that's fit to print, right? That's the way it is. Okay, that's number one. Number two, think about right now if a news anchor ended the broadcast if you watched a half-hour broadcast of news, which many people increasingly don't, right? Think if they ended it saying, "and that's the way it is." I mean, you would think, am I watching Bill O'Reilly, Rachel Maddow, right? That seems like a grandiose statement, doesn't it? Pronouncing on to all of us that you know how things are. You've described reality for all the news that's fit to print. Really, you have this capacious view of the entire universe. I think even for people who are concerned with fake news, right? That seems less and less. It's less and less palatable. It's less and less believable. It seems almost laughable. So, what this has created, I think, is an enormous problem for education, but also for the civic health of the nation, is a kind of cynicism. A cynicism that you see lurks in that disconnect between what you see in nonfiction programming, in nonfiction communication that's acceptable, and then how people think things really are. And this creates an opening for something like Jon Stewart, right? Which is how more people were getting news from him than a very talented guy. More people were getting news from him than regular news shows from the past. And this cynicism is a kind of easy breezy thing where you can write off what's going on because you know they're all corrupt. You don't have a handle on how the corruption actually works, right? And so you say, well, it's all corrupt, it's all bad, it's all garbage. I'm excused from my duties as citizen. We know that this is all going the wrong way. And there would be many statistical measures I would point to make that case, but in the interest of time, we'll move on. Let me suggest that our rhetoric in the rhetoric of the last century, the rhetoric of the Cold War, at least, and post-Cold War, for both political parties, and our public discourse during that time, has been controlled, invented, and manufactured and cultivated in a way that we have never really wanted to acknowledge. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Most rhetoric is thoughtful in some way. You're purposely being careful about what you say. But that world has been falsified. That world has been falsified. And what was that world? What did it consist of? Well, primarily, people were spending time on their screens, as they are now. Primarily, that world was created by television. That world was created by television. People were watching the news, and the news in 30 minutes presented the images together with words that they felt like they knew what was going on in the world because they had watched it. What changes? Very obviously in the last 20 years. What changes is video is not in control anymore. News anchors aren't in control anymore of the narrative. All of a sudden we have something called the internet, which for good and ill changes things irrevocably. I mean, it's never going back to what it was. And what did we see in this election? We saw a presidential candidate who, I mean, this is astounding, right? Roger just died. I mean, the guy who creates Fox News, the man who says to Nixon, "You better take TV seriously," just passed away. The age of TV just passed away. TV was how you got elected, and you knew early on in the 50s and 60s there was a reluctance. Politicians would say, "This is all for show, this is all ridiculous." And then eventually everyone just accepted it. This was the means of communication, this was how you rhetorically argued, and it was all through television. And what did Trump just do? Miraculously. I mean, in political science, this is an earthquake, right? All the money, you needed all the money because you had to spend it on TV advertising. And he did not spend all the money on TV advertising. And yet he was on TV all the time, billions of dollars in free television. And he wins without spending much at all on TV. He doesn't need to. He doesn't have to. Fake news. Fake news. Fake news comes to be, I think Jeff probably has a better sense of this and other things than I do, but fake news comes to be in this context. So all of a sudden we're frustrated. We're frustrated with what? We're frustrated with the fact that the mode of rhetoric that was normal has now changed for both parties on both sides. And it's unsettling, and it's frustrating, and there's obvious, I think, evils that everyone on all sides can point to. And so as that changes in that earthquake, we're outside the box of TV, and the rhetoric has changed, I think, for good. And that's unsettling. In that context, we all of a sudden say, well, the problem is fake news. The problem is a proliferation of articles on the internet, right, that are fake. Does that exist? Absolutely. Absolutely. But what's now thrown into question is the underlying question of journalism, right? How is this objective in the first place? What makes real news? And what makes fake news? And the concept of fake news comes about because the internet falsifies the world of TV and the passive reception of those images. In any event, I'll stop there as far as the election goes. And I would say, how do you get out of this? Well, you have to break through this kind of cynicism. You need, the parties are being reformed. I'm sure at the end of it will be messy, but they'll be more responsive to the actual needs of the people. But as far as education goes, it's interesting because I'm a liberal artsy guy, right? I mean, TAC, here we are at St. Mary's. But I don't need to go to the founders of these weird great book schools or anything like that to make my point. In this day and age, you can look at someone like Mark Cuban, right, who owns a basketball team and is on TV investing in various companies on Shark Tank, businessman, and he'll tell you what kind of education is actually going to be successful now. We're going to need people to tend the machines, right, to run the machines, to run the AI. But what you're going to need as far as leaders go is true liberal arts education. And there's going to be an increasing demand for them in the digital age into which we're moving. And so I just wanted to leave you with a thought about that. When we think about traditional liberal arts education, many times we talk about logic, grammar, and rhetoric as the old school trivium as something that's antiquarian, as if we're talking about something that we study just for the sake of studying it, rather than for the sake of practicing it. And obviously, these are arts. These are a form of doing. And so this I think, a Herculean effort to resurrect liberal arts education by schools like what we have in the program at St. Mary's, by Thomas Aquinas College. And the next step is to start integrating those with the rest of the fields and the disciplines. And in order to do that, we'd have to take them seriously. We'd have to take them seriously in a way that perhaps we haven't in the past.
Thank you, Matt. This leads to a very nice, seamless change to Jeff Martineau. Jeff and I first got acquainted when he was president of the American Academy for Liberal Education, which is an accrediting body that the ENRO program got connected with when we were under the gun to be accredited by WATS, the Western the accreditor on the West Coast. Jeff is now Vice President for the Center of the Study of Digital Life in New York City. It's the only strategic research group in the world concerned with the effects of digital technology on humans. Jeff has a background in politics. His doctoral studies are at Claremont Graduate University. Full disclosure, so is my doctorate in economics. I'm a Claremont University product as well. So it was almost not accidental that the panel came together the way it did. He has been a visiting professor in a number of places, but I think I'd like to have Jeff just take charge of the conversation at this point, if we can get the leaders to work.
If we get video, we'll be perfect. That's what they said a long time ago. Doesn't it?
While we're waiting for the video, the format I have in mind is that once Jeff has finished with this presentation, I want to give the panel a chance to sort of have a conversation among themselves, because that's really the model I was looking at, is that we would have a conversation, but then we'll cut them off so that the rest of you can join the conversation, or better yet, we'll include you in the conversation rather than cut them off. But I think because we're a small group, I think it'd be worthwhile to hear anyone and everybody who would like to have something to say.
Yeah, let's see if I can press buttons and make this work. Okay. All right, so this is the Media Ecology Association, a group that I have no connection to in any way, shape, or form, other than that Ted, I have friends, and I was invited for this panel, and then I'm on the plenary in the next session. And as Ted has mentioned, my background was in politics. That's my formal education, that's been my scholarship and so forth. But about 2 years ago, I joined a group in New York City, the Center for the Study of Digital Life. And we are a strategic research group. And any of you connected to MEA may know the president, Mark Stolman. He used to participate in MEA conferences. He's certainly friends with a number of you. And what I do is I develop research projects related to the world we now live in, which is digital. And I raise the money for those projects, and then I go out and I find the best scholars in the world in various fields for that research project. So I have money and I hire people. So that's another reason to come and talk to me afterwards. Marshall McLuhan is in the background of MEA in a number of ways. If you heard the opening remarks this morning, Marshall McLuhan's name was mentioned. And I'll be mentioning him, but I suspect I might disagree a bit from some of the interpretations that were presented earlier. But one thing I want us to keep in mind, in both the previous conversations, we talked about technology. Matt in particular is talking about television and the impact television has had on us since, say, World War II, and what it's created, what the byproduct is, and how we're now reacting to it. Well, Marshall McLuhan was described in this way. We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. Now, he did not mean any and every tool. He specifically meant mass communication tools. Specifically, he was an English literature professor, so his interest was in the printing press and books and the modern era, and the impact that had on people's psychology and their brains, their politics, and the culture that the printing press created. He wrote a famous book about the Guggenheim Press. He then discovered radio. His first grant was to the Rockefeller Foundation, where the Rockefellers wanted to know, what is radio doing to people, because we seem to not like it. This is the 30s and 40s, when we tend to think of it as, we have Stalin, we have Hitler, we also have Roosevelt. This was the area of radio and propaganda, and the Rockefellers were certainly concerned about what they saw as the effects of radio. Marshall was one of the researchers on that project. He then became most famous for studying television, the effects of television in the 60s. And he got on television, being more very well known because of that. But his argument was that we create these things. Human beings extended their brains, their nervous systems, and they created television for reasons. And the reason television was created in the 40s was, in theory, to educate us better than we were being educated previously. Right? So human beings create the technology, but then that technology, as it becomes mass, creates us. Okay? I'm going to mostly have questions. I'm not going to have a whole lot of statements. I'm not here to say this is what I think. Though there's a little bit of that. But mostly I want to put questions out, not just for us to talk about, hopefully we will, but hopefully in the coming years, as we enter research projects, these will become some of the questions. So I asked, what will citizenship look like in the digital era? And this is an era that will be less work, robots, artificial intelligence, computers, and more religion. Now we get this from Jürgen Habermas, right? This is the post-secular era we are now in. In other words, it's the post-television era. Now what will life be like in that era? So all the things we thought about citizenship, say in the West, or as a Catholic, or if you're in China, those are all going to be different depending on where you've been and how you've been impacted by technology, and what will they be in the coming years. What role will we need grammar schools and adult education to play? All right, so those are two different things, aren't they? But in a sense, I'm saying they're the same thing. Ted forwarded an essay to us a few weeks ago, written by a professor that was long gone before I was studying, but Ted knew of. A gentleman named Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss in 1959 gave the commencement address at the University of Chicago to the School for Adult Education. Well, why does Leo Strauss give the commencement address to the adults in the School of Education? Because he understood that those people would go out and educate. They would become teachers and so forth. In other words, it was these people in front of him that were then going to go and educate the young. And he understood that that was important. That was something we needed to be thinking about. Well, we need to be thinking about it now as well. When was the last time there was a surplus of humanity, lots of time on its hands? In other words, if we're going to be working less, we're going to have a lot more time on our hands. Okay? When was the last time that happened? Well, that would be medieval. And what came from that? We created universities. So part of my question, or my answer to some of this, is that if we're going to look to education, we can't look to anything that really exists now. There will have to be other institutions that will come about that will be very digital. In other words, they won't be back in time trying to preserve some aspect of culture or a time period and trying to get us to agree to that again. It will be something entirely different because we will be different. Our psychology will be different. In particular, those young among us and those not yet born will be very different in how they look at their world than we do because they will never have had the glowing box that ran their life and their families' lives and so forth and so on. That's not how they will get any of their information. They will have gotten all their information from the computer. And in fact, we all do that already, don't we? We want to know something, we don't go to the nightly news. If I want to know something, I look it up. Well, we couldn't do that 30 years ago because we didn't have this memory device. The libraries maybe didn't have what I needed, so I went to television and I relied upon what they told me and what was there. Well, that's different now. Is a new science of society and education needed? And let me offer Joseph Pieper's Leisure and the Basis of Culture as a possible window for us to look at how the future might be. For example, the idea of work or jobs as we think of it is very modern. It's in fact part of the Reformation. It's not Catholic in that sense. And Pieper talks a bit about that. What does putting all that memory in our brains, what is being on the computer all the time looking at things, what is that doing to us? It's unorganized. It's not structured. There's no one telling us how to do this or what it means. What will come from that? What is happening? Our psyche, how we perceive, view the world and ourselves under assault as digital, which is memory retrieval, overtakes television. Imagine a fantasy. When was the last time we went through something like this? Well, a few of us, not me really, but a few of us are old enough in the room. The last time we went through this chaos that some people think we are in would have been the late 1960s. And in 1968 in particular, maybe we'll have seen the Democratic National Convention on film and whatnot. Well, what was happening then? That was the radio era dying, and that was the television era overtaking it. And that election, in fact, those two elections, 68 and 72, were very interesting because 2016 did not play out like they did back then. Nixon won twice, and Nixon was the radio guy. He was the establishment guy. Television lost, but then television got its revenge in a certain sense right after that. Okay? So the last time we see conflict societal in the West, whether it was France or America, was the late 60s. My suggestion is that it may be a lot worse this time than it was then, and unfortunately, there were a lot of people that died back then. A fundamental shift has occurred. In Gestalt psychology, we have terms called ground and figure. We have gone from secondary orality, which is electric television, that's Walter Ong, who is very well known in the MEA circles. We've gone to secondary literacy. So secondary orality, before we wrote things down, we communicated orally. We still communicate orally. But electric and television encouraged us to be oral and not to be illiterate. My argument is now that we are now going back into a literate phase of humanity. Okay? This means that electric images, video, fake news, post-truth is what we are consciously aware of. It's exactly what Matt was talking about. But my argument is that that is superficial. We see it, it's constant. Television constantly needs to remind us of that, but it's not what's important anymore. It's what they're not talking about, what we're not thinking about, which is important, which is that we've all gone digital, we're no longer television. Marshall McLuhan described television as the full participatory sensory medium that formed us without us ever recognizing it. It was the generator of images that got us and memes that massaged and tribalized us, whether consumers or politics, while attempting to create a global village, universal ethics. Okay, definitely not Catholic in that sense. We no longer live in that world, as television, advertising, memes are now obsolete. There is no more mass communication. In other words, we self-publish, we say whatever we want, we go on Facebook and we opine. We no longer can be communicated with through mass communication. If they put something on television and said it was really important, most of us would not watch it. Okay? It simply is not the way to train us and to educate us in the culture any longer. We are undergoing a shift from imagination to memory. That's what digital is. Digital is literally a memory retrieval mechanism. It's the zeros and ones of computer language, of binary code. It was designed to write something down and then store it and then be able to go back and find it again when you want to recall it. All right? It's not imagination in that sense. It's not at all like television. But something quite different. This is not electric or a continuation of television. Something quite different and unlike anything humans have ever experienced. Here I'm referring to Thomas Aquinas and his writings on the four internal senses, and particularly on imagination and memory. Our perceptions, as opposed to our conceptions, are products of our senses of imagination or memory. We are experiencing a rebalancing with memory growing and imagination declining. What is digital? It's retrieval, memory hierarchies, binaries, zeros and ones. We're now learning through memory rather than merely imagination. So yes, we still watch some TV, yes, we still do movies and whatnot, but increasingly, we see them really as entertainment, which is what they are. They're fake. That's what they were intended to be. But for a long time, we made more of these things than they really were, and they got into our brains, and we started to try to act out those fantasies in our real life and as a culture. Well, we're doing less of that, and television, by the way, knows it. They know they're on the ropes, they know they have issues, and of course, they try to make as much money in the interim as they can before things really change on them. The digital paradigm is post-secular, as I mentioned Habermas before. There are now three spheres in the world. There's the digital sphere, which is robots, computers, artificial intelligence, and it's the tech elite, not too far from you here in Silicon Valley. Then we have the Western sphere, what is left of Western civilization that was built upon the Greek vocabulary and the early church, medieval, modern. That's all come apart. It's been coming apart for hundreds of years, so there's only remnants of things. There's bits and pieces here and there that we cobble together. And it's going to change. And that's the Western sphere right now. The Western sphere has been in crisis for a long time. Then we have the Eastern sphere. And this is Chinese. This is the Chinese civilization. The Chinese, unlike the West, are not in crisis. The Chinese know what they are, and they believe they have a 4,000-year-old civilization. They have the same ideograms and the same pictograms that they've had forever. They've not changed their language, and today they have a formal process of digitizing 4,000 years of Chinese history so that all Chinese can remember what they are. This is an important factor. In other words, the Chinese are not wannabe Westerners. They're not going to emulate us. They're not going to be like us. So I have questions. Are we going to create new universities, a new system? Are we going to bring back something called the three estates in the medieval era? One might argue that with the death of television is also the death of what we think of as democracy. And I'll say this. From a political perspective, the democracy that we have today is not the democracy that our founders talked about. That was a constitutional republic. Television doesn't portray a constitutional republic. It would portray something much different than that. And people do talk about this, the democracy is over in the West, and something else is going to replace it. And much of the fight in the coming decades is going to be what is going to replace it. One argument I'm making is an example for us is early medieval and the three estates. Those who pray, those who fight, and those who toil. But now we will have robots as the new serfs and those doing the toiling. How will we train the grammar school teachers of the digital era? What will that curriculum look like? Might it be big on memorization? Think again, medieval. How were people educated? Everyone's illiterate. There are no books. Everyone is oral. How do we learn? We learn through memorization. When we go to the liturgy, our Catholic liturgy is built on memorization. Why? Because the priest had to know it so well that he could never look it up. But he had so well memorized it in his education, he could then educate everyone else about the proper things to say and to do. So this is about thinking and about doing the right things and not having heresy. That brings us to etymology, grammar and analogy. What is one thing we do online? We look up the meaning of things constantly. That's etymology. What did it mean? And we have a problem with that in the West because in the Greek alphabet, we like to change the meaning of words periodically, and we like to invent new words. All right? So what we think something meant 1,000 years ago may have been something entirely different. And we've changed it over time. So I think a big part of education going forward is going to be exactly this. What do things mean? We're going to be looking up Latin again. We have our cell phones. We have the world's information, whether it's a museum or a library, in our hands now. How are we going to use that? What does that mean? I think that means that we're going to have something called data over facts, and I'll get to that in a second. A word is worth 1,000 pictures. Usually it's the other way around. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Maybe not anymore. Maybe we don't value images anymore, and it's going to become the other way around. How have we learned? Mimetic. This is Merlin Donald. This is Rene Girard. This is the idea that we made, that some guy 2 million years ago made a tool, and other people saw it and whatnot, and we emulated, we grunted. We had no language, but we emulated one another. Okay? That's, even with language, that's still how we have learned as a culture and created a civilization and created culture. We copy one another. When do we learn? We learn everything we need to know by age 13. We know that medical doctors that do brain research know that. Psychologists know that. By age 13, there's nothing new that you're going to learn other than some details, facts, and so forth. Whatever the morality is, you're going to learn it. Whatever the rules of the road are, you're going to have learned it by then. It's done. So by the way, that's not higher education, not by age 13. We were oral up to about 700, and then we get Homer, and we start to get a written language. And by Plato, we've worked that language out, and now the Greeks have formalized that language. The same time, by the way, the Persians do it and the Chinese do it at the same time frame. So this happens for everyone in the world at the same time. We were then scribal until the printing press, from 500 BC to about 1500. And then the printing press was like a bomb that went off, and it changed everything. Instead of using our senses, all of our senses, we started looking down. And our horizon flattened out. We started to have hierarchy, and we started to put the book off the shelf and no longer memorize things. This was a narrowing of knowledge, purposefully so, because it was very much driven by the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation. We have the printing press, and then we get electric, the telegraph, the telephone, and the newspaper. Then we get the radio, the television, and now we've gone digital. Each of these impacted our brains differently. We have neural pathways. And in each case, these technologies impacted them differently, not unlike when we take a drug. Each drug is designed to go down different neural pathways and have a different effect. It's no different this way with these communication. So you can just think of how We learned from one another how we gain information and how we interacted with the rest of the world and thought of ourselves. It changed over time. What will citizenship mean in the digital era? Well, it means civitas under the Romans. Roman citizenship was something very particular and very Roman, and it was not like being in Persia. All right? Will it be the particular over the universal? Well, one would argue with the election last year, that's where things are going. Is more people are not concerned about the particular. That might be their faith, that might be their family, that might be their community, over the idea of unity, the universal, everyone's going to become the same, universal citizenship. One world is done. Contrast that with the Chinese and the digital elite, both of whom have very different views on citizenship. To be Chinese is to be Chinese, and that means something. And it doesn't matter that you moved to America, you're still Chinese. And for the digital elite, they have a different view of what it's going to mean to be a world citizen. It's not going to be like it was in television, but it's still going to be something like universal. What is data? Data is what is given or remembered. It's Latin for data. It also means index, sign, indication, attestation, testimony, and evidence. What is fact? It's merely an act or achievement or a mathematical multiplication. We have all human knowledge in our pockets, now what? During the election, there was a lot of talk about experts, and experts being wrong and not being relied upon anymore. That will increase in the post-television era. What will the digital trivium and quadrivium be in the new digital grammar school? Just to remind you, those were grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then the other four were arithmetic, music, astronomy, and geometry. Will these come back? We've been talking about liberal education. That's not the liberal education that most of us would recognize. And there's literally no school, hardly a school, that actually does this anymore. All right? So will this be the framework for the new grammar school in some way, shape, or form? If we're remembering, perhaps so. Grammar school led to higher learning of philosophy and theology. So when you were age 13, 14, or 15, or 16, you were done. And you went on and you really learned things. You stopped the memorization and you started to become educated. And we haven't done that. That's not our system now. Is that what we're going to have? How can we survive in a world of hallucinations? Well, we're seeing a lot of that today. Television is full of it, and television wants to show us the nuttiness. But we're going to start to see, I think, more of a conflict between more of us as we perhaps deal more with reality and those that wish to hang on to the lives that they've had for decades, which they're starting to realize are coming apart and are very much fantasy-oriented. You can see, for example, virtual reality. And virtual reality already is in trouble. It's not been what the promoters of it had hoped, partly because we seem to not want to go there, which I find interesting. And I would say why? It's because we've gone digital and we're not television anymore. VR is mixed into television. What happens when memory confronts illusion? Who will organize the grammar school in the future? It's not the current crop. There is no reform. If you think there's a problem in education and you think it can be reformed, I can just tell you from experience, it will not happen, period. It will have to be something new. There is no such thing as reforming education. Are there historical examples we can look at? How about the Carolingian Renaissance? This is Charlemagne. What does Charlemagne do around 1800? He creates a court where he brings in the elite minds to his court to bring all of the knowledge into one place and have it written down. This became the birth, 200 years later, of universities. All right? And part of that was St. Alcuin. St. Alcuin was a Brit brought by Charlemagne to France. He is considered the father of eventually what we would call the trivium. Might we be in a similar situation now? Might that be an example for us to be able to look at, because there's nothing in the modern era for us to look at. And his method was, we educate the elites, not very many of them, because then they go out and educate everybody else. In other words, we don't start at the bottom and educate the ignorant people out in the fields and whatnot. We educate those that actually have a place and position in the brain, and then they then disseminate from there. And that's why I think the idea of adult education is so important, because we have to educate the teachers. The other one I want to mention is Romano Guardini, an Italian, European-Italian theologian, early part of the last century. For those that may or may not know, Guardini is someone that Pope Francis greatly admired his writings. Not just in the Lord, but he also wrote letters from Lake Como, which looked at technology. As far as I can tell, Guardini is the only Catholic theologian in the modern world that ever took technology seriously, as in what is it doing to us and what do we need to do and how should we interact with it. He's then famous for doing The End of the World in 1948. Well, this is after the war, and he's now talking about how the radio era has ended, television has started, and he has tapped into that in some way. And then he writes that he gives a lecture in 1959 to a group of engineers in Germany. Well, the engineers were early computer scientists, and his lecture reflects that concern about machines and what impact that has on us, psychologically, morally, and what do we need to be doing about that as human beings. And essentially what he argues is that we need to get a group of really smart people together and figure this out, because if we don't, the engineers will figure it out for us. And it'll be too late. We will not have had a clue what happened to us. I'll just have a couple of quotes on it. This one I think is 1959. It says, "Thus, dangers of the most diverse kind arise out of the power that machines give. Physically, one human group subjugates another in open or in concealed conflict. Mentally and spiritually, thinking and the feeling of the one influence the other. We need think only of the influence of the media, advertising, and public opinion." This is the 1950s, and he's a European. He wasn't around for the 60s and 70s and 80s and the real nuttiness of television. Okay? But already he understood something was going on psychologically with us. And I have a few more, but we don't have to look at those now. I'm happy to share them and so forth. Thank you.
So in the balance of time that we have, I think I'd like to open this up to a conversation with all of you, with the presenters. I think if you have followed the thread that's been developed, there is a coherence, at least to me, because as we discovered this morning, the first thing we should be learning as a skill is the hearing skill, or I try to translate that into the listening skill, and how most of us don't listen very well. And so I think we started off with an idea that's pretty ancient that Tom gave us, which is this idea of the unity of something. And that unity, I think in the very classical sense, is something that points to what most moderns would think is imaginary, which is the truth or the good. And I think Matt sort of set us up with one of the reasons we have all of this sort of fragmentation of views of the world is because we have been managing the world to collect ways to fragment us further. Witness the motivation of Amazon to buy Whole Foods. What in the world would Amazon do with Whole Foods? They're going to gain a lot of information about those of you who like bananas, who like organic meats, who like other things, and correlate that through their data manipulation for their particular communities, so they can target messages not for sale of Amazon products necessarily, but the sale of the information for those people who want to exploit the information. And then, of course, we finally have Jeff's interesting challenge, and that is the role of how education, are we out of business? I'm beginning to think that if we're going to reform education, the best thing we can do is to take care of the surplus that we identify as teachers and find a way to eliminate that pool and start all over again. Because old dogs like me will not enter into being an effective teacher in a digital world. So with that fear, please challenge our panelists.
I have a question for you, Jeff. So it sounds like Tom sort of wants reform in education almost by moving backwards, keeping technology, but going back to the great books and the traditional liberal arts. And then you come up here and say, I'll tell you it's not going to work, there's no such thing as reform, it has to be new. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure.
And also say if old could be new, since it's
Sure.
no longer current?
I have two great books, guys, and my experience, well, three, I guess. And my experience with great books is I did not attend great books, but in my role at the American Academy for Education, I accredited all of the great books programs in schools. So I came to know all of them very, very, very well in that sense. So here's my argument. The Great Books program came about in the 1930s. It is not an old idea. Why did it come about? It came about as a reaction to what was going on both here in social science, but also to what was going on in Europe. We talked earlier about Germany and so forth. And so a few folks came back and said, this mass move of secularism at that time and reliance upon technology was a problem. And for some people they said, well, the way for us to solve that and to go back to, say, the American founders or some other aspect of modernity would be to come up with this collection of texts and have people read them so that they're getting those ideas as a way to counter what was going on by the 1930s and 40s, which was essentially a form of propaganda. So the answer to propaganda was one of two possibilities. One became great books, Chicago, so forth and so on. The other became television. So while great books folks were good social scientists trying to figure out what we should do to help humanity, their counterparts in the larger part of social science were figuring out radio was really bad, look at the war, look at the millions of people, and by the way, old education methods failed because we went out and killed one another and we're not all singing Kumbaya and so forth and so on. The solution for them became television, because that became the way to make everyone think the same. All right? So that became the way to peace of a certain sense. So if we're going to say the old, I might argue that in fact, we are going to go to the old, but we're not going to go back to the 1800s and the 1700s. I think that what most people recognize is that modernity is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Right? That where we got today is part of liberalism. So why would we go back to another part of liberalism and try to get it right again? But there are many conservatives that make that argument. Many that we know would make that argument. My argument is that for many people, they're going to go back and say, what about before the modern era? What was going on there? And by the way, that's medieval. And there's a lot of interesting stuff there, both from the church and otherwise, for us to grapple with and to talk about and to debate and to figure out and to see what might work. Keep in mind that there's a challenge we have in the modern era, and that's this idea of authority. So we have this idea that we're Democrats, we're democratic, right? And there's no real authority, we're somehow in charge. Well, one would argue, no, that was a pipe dream, we really are not. And the current president probably helped to push a lot of people to really think that maybe that's not quite true in the modern era. Well, there used to be a time when we didn't have problems with authority, because authority didn't resemble what we think of as authority now. That's something for us to be thinking about. In other words, when the job participation rate is 30%, it's about 61% now. That's a lot more people in the growing population that are not going to be working. We're probably not going to be concerned about democracy at that point. We're going to be wondering, what are we doing and where are we going? Because there's something wrong with this in some way, shape, or form. I don't know if that answers the question.
I've got all sorts of thoughts from these presentations. I think homeschooling is an interesting way of seeing, you know, a shift. And I remember when Betsy DeVos was going through her, I live in Grand Rapids.
Okay.
And my university, though begun by liberals, is now grown to a large university which has buildings with DeVos' name on it. Some of us still have the leftover sensibilities before, and we're pretty, you know, unhappy to see. I think there were people who felt that the system could be reformed. And when asked, you know, I kind of said, well, I guess it's just time for a different paradigm of education. You know, this is going to further erode and dissolve. Maybe the liberals, or whatever they, some good people are going to have to start homeschooling and start up a new kind of tree that's happening. And I think that you know, the grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the trivium and quadrivium, I think that is an interesting way to approach it. My paper tomorrow is titled Plato's Allegory of Decay, Literacy and the Good. And, you know, my beef with the way people read the Allegory of Decay, because there's so many, it's great, it's just a great place to go. A lot of people are going there right now. But they forget that the sun, the enlightenment, it's the good. The sun is the good. The sun is not the truth. Truth is not talking. People talk about the forms and justice and truth and beauty and the good, and they toss them around in a big salad as if they're the same. But in the Republic, if you read it, there's a whole section on the sun, and he uses this as a metaphor for the good. It stands for the good. And that's what people keep forgetting. And what is the good? Well, we don't know. And it might be that people think religion is where good is now, in a way that before good might have been for, like, a good politician. Now there's no good politician, there's only good in the, but it's the good that people are chasing around. That's gonna, I don't know, that's, I think, some of the approach that people might take when they're trying to answer this question of where we're gonna have to go, where we're gonna go next. I mean, I think they should go to the good, because everything else can recalibrate itself underneath it. You know, sometimes a lot of food is good, sometimes not so much food is good. Sometimes.
If I could add, I think that homeschooling, more than anything going on in public, whether it's charter or otherwise, I do think that there's some very interesting things, because there are people doing homeschooling that does not look like anything that we would see at any other kind of school. And they really have gone back, and they are retrieving some of these medieval things. And that's how they're educating, and their curriculum's now being written along those lines.
You're going to say that, I mean, it's just the great books movement in a way is like this, but you have all these individual people almost trying out homeschooling, which has grown in popularity, right, exponentially. It's not just religious folks, and it tends to this. I mean, from every the data I can get on it, it seems like it tends towards this retrieval of what's old, and some kind of old, we'll call it classical, whatever that means, or liberal arts education. And then you see the sprouting up of you know, new academies as well. Even if they're making, if you're right about the mistake they're making, they're going back, right? I mean, the Great Arts Academies, right, is a great example out of Arizona. And then you got Larry Arnott Hillsdale with the Founders Academy sprouting up all over the place. And whenever you think of each one of these examples, there is this return. I would like to say something in a context of fake news to your comment. And that is, I spent 3 years looking at looking at how people evaluate educational programs and evaluating many myself. And I think the disturbing thing to the newcomer when it came to evaluation was how content knowledge was a thing, right? That the phrase content knowledge, right, is a category is disturbing, because what you're concerned with so much of that field is procedure, right, and not actual content. And so you get to the point where you say, well, in Massachusetts, they're really good at American history because they're required to know stuff about it. Why are we're arguing about this, right? So the content, right, becomes secondary, and now we have all this colossus, this educational system that's set up based upon procedures and delivery. And we don't want to talk about content, because then we'd have to get in these questions where we disagree, right? And that's how you hollow out civics and American history. We disagree on this stuff, so let's just call the whole thing off. We can easily go to STEM education, and as we all know, the Nazis were really good at STEM education.
I just recently rented a shed from a woman to do artwork, and she's got some sort of junky lady shop, crazy place, and she just kept saying to me, I want good people. Yes. We're looking for good people. And she didn't care how I did my art. She didn't care what my art was. She said, I'm looking for good people. And I gave her my $75 for the month, and I said, I'm going to be a good person. I hope I live up to your expectation. And she's building a little world in the corner of our neighborhood. You know, this is like it's a grassroots kind of effort, but I think, and I didn't tell her to say that word, you know, I was like, oh, we're on the same page here.
Well, isn't that neutral procedure, I mean, the problem is that education in some sense could be described as instilling a love for what's good. You know, dare we say that? And I think it would be important to think about the trivium, though, in the way that I think part of the mistake people make when they try to bring it back is they make it about procedure as well. So it's about logic and rhetoric, which are procedural, and not about grammar, which is about the meaning of things. And that's a really interesting thing that happens when people try to bring the trivium back. You see them focus on logic and rhetoric, and they sort of ignore the deeper meaning of grammar.
Just to add in, McLuhan was a grammarian. That's how he described himself. So when he wrote his dissertation, he wrote it on the trivium, and it's clearly about grammar.
While you were talking, you circled to what I was going to ask. I wanted to hear your opinion on this idea that the future of education is not in content knowledge, but in critical thinking skills and evaluation skills. And you just said that, the grammar part. It doesn't matter what we teach as long as we teach people to analyze and evaluate anything. What do you think about that?
No.
No.
No, in other words, I think that, yes, that was the way. And I think it's kind of been the modern view of it. Doesn't matter. We can train devils and it'll all work out as long as we have the right process and box to put people in. Part of my argument is that that's no content in that sense is going to come to matter, and the process is no longer going to matter. In other words, if we're going to talk about the good, then people are going online and they're looking things up and they're trying to figure out stuff. And I'll give you an example I mentioned to Ted, and Matt and I have talked about this. In seminary, in Catholic seminary today, young men, 22-year-old, 25-year-old men, so they're born in the 1990s. They have no idea what the church was before Vatican II, right? They've never experienced the Latin Mass, in other words. And they're now in seminary and they're saying, we want the Latin Mass. We want to do the Latin Mass. Well, where does that come from? That's coming from them. That's coming from them going. So that's content then does matter. The specifics matter.
I just wanted to put the word apprentice and apprentice program on the table, because that's very medieval too, right? And also very traditional in all the parts of the world that may not be included in your 3 spheres, right? And among the indigenous people in Canada, there's a huge rise of indigeneity and move to indigenize the curriculum and all this. So we talk about it all the time. But in those parts of the world, it is all about, you know, being 4 years old, 7 years old, working with your father, your grandfather, and certainly connected with the land, and then learning the tools from the ground up. And so the apprenticing is so much part of what we need to bring back.
And you can see
in
that
every trade and every.
You can see how that makes sense in my example before of St. Alcuin. So he's a priest, okay?
Yeah.
Who is he educating? He is educating those that will be the priests. Because then what do? They then educate their congregation.
Yeah.
So if you think about it this way, it used to be there was no such thing as theology as a formal part of the education then. It wasn't part of the trivium or the quadrivium. Why? Because you got that as a kid every day as part of your life in the cathedral city, town, so forth and so on.
But so did the stonemasons,
Mm-hmm.
right? And,
Oh, yeah.
and the illustrators and
They were
the
Catholic in that.
farmers,
So medieval
and
meant Catholic.
herbalists, and, yeah.
So what you're really leading up to with the comment about apprentices is the important distinction between information and knowledge. We all have access to information. We often mistakenly call it knowledge. We only know of it as knowledge to ourselves when we decide to use it. So the behavioral step of making a decision is the act of converting information or fact to something more tangible. So in many ways, I don't know if there's anything really called fake news. It's just news that is fake to us until we look at the consequences of the decisions we make based on that news. Because we're not always correct as decision makers. This all goes back. Some of you have, through this, have a general systems background through the MEA. I have in my roots in economics back to Kenneth Boulding, who was the one who introduced general systems thinking into economics. And he's the one who got me to begin to think about the notion of information and how it is used within the economic decision processes. But that forced me to begin to study the psychology of decision making. And often the major step there is an act of faith. Who do you believe has given you information that's worthy to translate into a decision you make?
Excuse me, I'm trying to formulate my questions because there are a number of them. I wanted to respond to what you just said. It seems to me that there's a certain sense in which knowing can be a subjective thing. Is that what you're saying? And yet today, our plenary speaker was very energetic to say that global warming is real fact, claims against it are false fact, and it's our obligation and moral responsibility to carry the truth, the knowledge out into our classrooms. And I guess I would wonder, in other words, not all facts have equal status or should have.
That's why I made the distinction between data, coming back to it, data versus facts.
Okay.
What he was presenting this morning was facts, not data.
Okay, so which is privileged?
Well, data is the reality. Facts are someone's interpretation of what they think is correct.
Well, okay. Bracket that for just a minute, because I don't know what you just said.
Seems backwards to me.
Pardon?
I'm sorry, that seems, that facts are those indisputable things, as Yogi Berra said, you could look it up. And data is the most manipulable thing in our society right now.
A data point is a data point. It is what it is.
The algorithm doesn't determine that?
Sure.
The algorithm that Jeff
Yeah, okay, so, yes, so that, but now you're talking about Facebook aggregating things and essentially trying to get to a point by in other words, they want to get to certain facts. So they're utilizing the data in a certain way to get to certain facts. That was the way I interpreted the presentation this morning. Is that he has data, he has plenty of data, and he's taken certain data points to get to a certain fact that he believes to be morally correct. That doesn't make it true. And I think that that's part of my point is that in the digital world, we are starting to become more concerned about, is that actually true?
Which brings me then to the second half of my question is, it seems to me a little bit unclear to me how on the one hand, we're talking about people deciding truth and processing on the one hand, but then we're going to talk about going to the dictionary to find the meaning of a word when there are certain language theories that suggest the words mean what we mean in the act of meaning them contextually.
Not Chinese.
Pardon?
Not Chinese.
Maybe not.
But no, but it can't be maybe, maybe not. So in other words, what that means to me is there's a big part of the world that has said no. It meant that then. If you want to do something else, you write a different character, and the character then means something else. But we don't take a character that used to mean this, and now it means that. We create something different if we want to.
Are you suggesting that there's been no adaptation or flexibility in the Chinese language over the last 1,000 years?
Not like in Greek.
Well, maybe not like in Greek, but maybe more than in Latin. Because,
sure.
You know, I mean...
But that's part of my point of the idea of etymology. Part of what we are doing as a society is we are increasingly want to know, what do these things mean and how? So it's not good to just look up one definition, but then you're starting to...
Or do I attribute meaning?
Isn't that something that, doesn't that become informed by what you are able to look at? In other words, the textbook or the expert is no longer sufficient.
So I got that in the classroom all the time.
That's no longer sufficient. That's why we don't pay attention to the nightly news and so forth. Right? Now we have to be able to go out and find these other things, and then maybe we'll turn out to be okay. Yes, they're correct. But the whole idea of etymology, I wonder whether or not that's going to become the foundation for education in the West, because it is certainly not the foundation of how we educate people today.
I've got a current study project that might be interesting. We could talk in about a month if I can finish the book. I've read one translation of Confucius done by a Chinese Western educated. Right? So he's going to the original manuscripts, he's translating it into English. I've got one now, but by another Chinese, not Western educated, who is in turn translating it back into English, using English as his second language. And I want to put the two translations side by side because I really think there is a difference in the translator. But that's not the Chinese, it's the translator imposing their interpretation of what the characters.
But you could have two native-born Chinese, non-Western educated people who would take those language symbol systems and maybe have different interpretations.
I'm not sure that there's a variance that we want.
Well, this is hypothetical.
They could
But I'll give a real example of what's going on in China today at the official Communist Party level. Their official policy is to digitize Chinese history. Part of what that means is that they are saying we are Chinese. We are going to make sure that we can pass on to all those that will be Chinese after us what Chinese is. And we're going to go back to 4,000 years. We're going to digitize as much as is there. In other words, they're not saying that, well, we were this there and we were here, there, and so forth. Whereas in the West, we more or less do that. Well, that's what they believed in the medieval. And then we believe that there, and so forth and so on. They're saying, no, we're one people with one history and one civilization. And that's how we're going to educate people. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong. I'm merely saying that is the approach to education. And that's why their society looks so radically different.
Before the question I was thinking about before, how can the Chinese people think this way? I'm a practitioner of Tai Chi since 30 years, more than 30 years now. How can you speak about one language, for example? They can't produce one history. There's no one Chinese. This is provocative, but it's true. There's no one Chinese. So how can they produce one history? They got the oldest living culture as we consider it. You stated they claim to, they think they have the oldest culture ongoing, but they don't have any single language as we, for example, Italians have. So my question could be, how can trivial become trivial in our vocabulary? Because you was talking about meaning. And there's a book, interesting book, this Trivium for 21st Century that I read a couple of years ago from an English teacher that you should look at. I got a digital version here, and it's from 2013, Trivium 21st Century.
What's the author?
The author is, sorry, because I didn't find the digital version in my hard disk, but I find it on Amazon. It's Martin Robinson. You got it.
I think she doesn't understand. I think she doesn't understand what the trivium was. And
he doesn't understand.
Sorry.
Martin Robinson doesn't understand. I mean, he gets from the sources of Catholic religion and from the books that made history. So maybe we're talking about.
I'll give you a comparison. Marshall McLuhan's dissertation was on the trivium. Now, what did he do? He took the approach of a classicist. So his entire book is all original source material. It's not interpretations. It's very Catholic, and of course, that means it's entirely Catholic. It's not something that is imposed upon afterwards. It makes a very interesting comparison of how we over time have come to think about the trivium. In other words, it's not simply an educational model. I mean, grammar, for example, or an analogy is not simply just a way to think about something. It is an attempt to actually get to the truth of something. But of course, that's different from logic. Very different from logic, because in logic there isn't the interpretation factor.
I think at this point, I want to call a halt to the formal session and let this expand into the break, because we need to be able to get some transit time between this and the plenary session scheduled at 3 o'clock. So I want to thank our, it's at 3. Okay. So I'd like to thank our panelists for coming out on this warm afternoon in Moraga, and to thank the audience for their perseverance in the heat, and wish you well in the rest of it. The Soda Center for the plenary session, it is air conditioned.